It's an honor to be at the Economic Club of Chicago, and I certainly appreciate the special arrangements you have made to allow me to be here this afternoon. And I want to thank all the distinguished citizens of this great city who are here today. I'm also mindful that I'm speaking in the hometown of my boss, and President Obama sends his greetings, as do Rahm Emanuel and David Axelrod and the rest of the Chicago crew. They are no doubt discovering that Washington is the true Windy City. The place where those who travel the high road of humility encounter little heavy traffic. The only place in the world you can see a prominent person walking down Lover's Lane holding his own hand. The issue that brings me here today is central to the security of all Americans, the future of the United States military, how it should be organized, equipped, and funded in the years ahead to win the wars we are in while being prepared for threats on or beyond the horizon. Earlier this year, I recommended to President Obama, and he enthusiastically agreed, that we needed to fundamentally reshape the priorities of America's defense establishment and reform the way the Pentagon does business, in particular the weapons we buy and how we buy them. Above all, to prepare to wage future wars rather than continuing the habit of rearming for previous ones. I'm here on relatively short notice to speak publicly about these matters because the Congress is, as we speak, debating the President's defense budget request for the next fiscal year, a budget request that implements many needed reforms and changes. Of course, after September 11th, some things did change. The base defense budget, not counting the spending for the wars, increased by some 70% over the next 8 years. During this period, there were important changes in the way U.S. forces were organized, based, and deployed, and investments were made in new technologies such as unmanned aerial vehicles. However, when all was said and done, the way the Pentagon selected, evaluated, developed, and paid for new weapons systems and equipment did not fundamentally change, even after September 11th. Indeed, the kinds of equipment, programs, and capabilities needed to protect our troops and defeat the insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan were not the highest priority of much of the Defense Department, even after several years of war. I learned about this lack of bureaucratic priority for the wars we are in the hard way during my first few months on the job as the Iraq surge was getting underway. The challenges I faced in getting what our troops needed in the field stood in stark contrast to the support provided conventional modernization programs, weapons designed to fight other modern armies, navies, and air forces, programs that had been in the pipeline for many years and had acquired a loyal and enthusiastic following in the Pentagon, in the Congress, and in industry. The most pressing needs of today's warfighter on the battlefield, in the hospital, or at home simply lacked place and power at the table when priorities were being set and long-term budget decisions were being made. So the most important shift in President Obama's first defense budget was to increase and institutionalize funding for programs that directly support those fighting America's wars and their families. Those initiatives included more helicopter support, airlift, armored vehicles, personal protection equipment, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets for our troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. In addition, we also increased the funding for programs that provide long-term support to military families and treatment for the signature wounds of these wars, such as traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. First, there's the Congress, which is understandably concerned, especially in these tough economic times, about protecting jobs in certain states and districts. There is the defense and aerospace industry, which has an obvious financial stake in survival and growth of these programs. And then there is the institutional military itself, within the Pentagon, and as expressed through an influential network of retired generals and admirals, some of whom are paid consultants to the defense industry, and some who are often quoted as experts in the news media. As a result, many of past attempts by my predecessors to end failing or unnecessary programs have gone by the wayside. Nonetheless, perhaps in a triumph of hope over experience, I determined, and the President agreed, that given the urgency of the wars we are in, the daunting global security environment we will inhabit for decades to come, and our country's economic problems, we simply cannot afford to move ahead with business as usual. To this end, the President's budget request cut, curtailed, or ended a number of conventional modernization programs: satellites, ground vehicles, helicopters, fighters, that were either performing poorly or excess to real-world needs. Conversely, future-oriented programs, where the U.S. was relatively underinvested, were accelerated or received more funding. For example, we must sustain and continually improve our specialized strategic deterrent to ensure that our and our allies' security is always protected against nuclear-armed adversaries. And so in an initiative little noticed, the President's program includes money to begin a whole new generation of ballistic missile submarines and nearly $700 million in additional funds to secure and assure America's nuclear deterrent. I believe, along with the senior uniformed military leadership of this nation, that the defense budget we proposed to President Obama and that he sent to the Congress is the best we could design to protect the United States now and in the future. The best we could do to protect our men and women in uniform, to give them the tools they need to deter our enemies and to win our wars today and tomorrow. We stand by this reform budget, and we are prepared to fight for it. A final thought. I arrived in Washington 43 years ago this summer. Of all people, I am well aware of the realities of Washington and know that things do not change overnight. After all, the influence of politics and parochial interests in defense matters is as old as the Republic itself. Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War, was charged with building the first American fleet. And to get the support of Congress, Knox eventually ended up with 6 frigates being built in 6 different shipyards in 6 different states. But the stakes today are very high. With the nation at war and a security landscape steadily growing more dangerous and unpredictable, I am deeply concerned about the long-term challenges facing our defense establishment, and just as concerned that the political state of play in Washington does not reflect the reality that major reforms are needed or that tough choices and real discipline are necessary. We stand at a crossroads. We simply cannot risk going down the same path, where our spending and program priorities are increasingly divorced from the very real threats of today and the growing ones of tomorrow. These threats demand that all of our nation's leaders rise above the politics and parochialism that have too often plagued considerations of our national defense. From industry to interest groups, from the Pentagon to Foggy Bottom, from one end of Pennsylvania Avenue to the other. The time has come to draw a line and take a stand against the business-as-usual approach to national defense. We must all fulfill our obligation to the American people to ensure that our country remains safe and strong. And just as our men and women in uniform are doing their duty to this end, we in Washington must do ours. Thank you very much.